Our speaker this evening has been a career civil servant, recently retired, who seems to have been a founder member of almost every military history society you can care to name. He has been on the council of the Society of Army Historical Research for 11 years, only retiring last year, where he took on the role of chairing the Templar Committee, looking at the books submitted for the Society's annual Templar Prize. Like me, he's also a battlefield guide, and unlike me, he's also a member of the British Commission for Military History. He is an expert on the Italian campaign, and of course, the subject of the talk this evening, which is part of the North African campaign. So without any more by way of introduction, I'd like John Peaty, Dr. John Peaty, to give us his talk this evening on Alam Halfa.
Thank you, Dudley, for that very kind introduction. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, outfoxing the fox. On the 15th of November 1942, across a dismal and weary Britain, the church bells rang out on the orders of Churchill to celebrate the crushing victory of the 8th Army over Rommel's Axis forces in North Africa, in the western desert of Egypt, at El Alamein, to be precise. It is sometimes forgotten that there were actually 3 battles of Alamein. First Alamein, 1st to the 27th of July, Alam Halfa, 30th of August to 5th of September, and Second Alamein, 23rd of October to 11th of November. And in this talk tonight, I'm going to look at Alam Halfa. After taking Tobruk, capturing large quantities of men, material and maps on the 21st of June, Rommel invaded Egypt. During the first Battle of Alamein, his drive on Egypt was stopped by Auchinleck. In August, Churchill replaced Auchinleck by the team of Alexander and Montgomery, and building on Auchinleck's plans, they intended to defeat Rommel's next attack, hoping to break through to Cairo, Alexandria, the Nile Delta and the Suez Canal. And then once they defeated Rommel, they planned to go over to the offensive. As Rommel planned his attack in August, he faced several challenges. Firstly, his lines of communication were now overextended. Secondly, he was now short of petrol thanks to attacks on his supply ships. Thirdly, key sources of intelligence were now denied to him. On the 29th of June, the code used by the US military attaché in Cairo for reporting to Washington was changed and no longer breakable by the Axis. On the 10th of July, his signals intelligence unit, 621 Radio Intercept Company under Captain Seabohm, was captured. Among the mass of material found in Seabohm's possession were the British map reference code and the British call sign book. And fourthly, the fourth challenge was the terrain. It was now unfavourable. With its ridges, impassable areas and areas of soft going, the topography of the Alamein position gave it great natural strength, which is why it was chosen by Auchinleck as the place to stop Rommel's drive into Egypt. In a study of the Battle of Alam Halfa, Bayerlein, who was both Chief of Staff of the Africa Corps as well as its acting commander during the opening phase of the battle, wrote, "Rock wastes, arid, barren, desolate terrain, interspersed with patches of sand, where meagre clumps of desert thorns grow, where the African sun burns down mercilessly. That was the Alamein front. It was situated between the rock-bound heights of Tel El Isa on the Mediterranean coast and the 200-meter-high pyramid of Garet El Haimamat on the Qattara Depression, the only position secure against encirclement on either flank on the entire North African desert. The Qattara Depression extends over 7,500 square miles and is up to 133 meters below sea level. because of its salt lakes and pans, high cliffs and escarpments, and very fine powdered sand. It is impassable to tanks and all but the lightest vehicles. Between the Qattara Depression and the sea, there are several smaller depressions known as Dare, including the Ragil and the Agram, and two major ridges, Roisat, which featured in the First Battle of Alamein, and Alam Halfa, which features in the second battle, the battle known as Alam Halfa. The latter ridge runs 10 miles from and parallel to the coast and reaches a height of 132 meters above sea level. For the benefit of armoured forces, 8th Army produced special sheets with going overprints, and they're in colour. So blue means generally impassable, green is recce essential before movement, continuous low gear, yellow is fair, and red is firm and fast. And to refine the colour coding, overprinted text was used, such as treacherous soft going on green. In 1947, Freddie de Guingon, who was Monty's chief of staff and formerly the Aux chief of intelligence, revealed the trick played on Rommel at Alam Halfa, publishing facsimiles of both the real and the fake going map he had made and planted on Rommel. He wrote, "I will break off here to describe a ruse which we afterwards learned had helped to defeat Rommel. We always produced going maps which were layered in colours to show the type of desert insofar as it affected movement. We knew the enemy had captured many of our maps and was making use of them. At the time of the retreat to Alamein, no going maps existed of the area to the rear of our positions. These we produced after we had settled in. I therefore decided to have made a false going map, which would link up quite correctly with the maps already in enemy hands, and then to falsify a particular area to suit our plans. The area I selected in consultation with our intelligence staff was one south of Alam Halfa. Due south of the highest point was an area of very soft sand. As we appreciated the enemy would make for this ridge, I thought that by showing this bad area as good going, the enemy might be tempted to send his tanks around that way. It would also give him a shock if he were making for El Hammam, for instead of a good gallop, he would find himself wallowing in deep sand. We had this map secretly printed in very quick time by the energy of an old associate of mine in the MI Directorate in Cairo, Stuart Menteith. Then we plotted with 13 Corps to have it captured by the enemy. In the south, light forces were continually patrolling around the enemy's minefields, and so it was arranged that a scout car should get blown up on a mine and that the crew would be taken off in another truck. Left in the scout car were soldiers' kits and the usual junk, while stuffed away in a haversack was an old and dirty going map, the fake, covered in tea stains, but quite readable. The car had been ransacked by the next morning and the map had disappeared. The enemy certainly got badly bogged down in this particular area. But how much the map was to blame, I don't quite know. From interrogations of prisoners, however, we did obtain confirmation that a falsified map led the enemy to send their tanks into this sandy terrain, which trebled their fuel consumption. We also knew that Rommel put down the failure of his offensive to petrol shortage. So it looks as if it probably helped. Thus, Freddie de Guingon in 1947. And on this map in the center, you can see the Agram Depression. And you can also see clearly that 15th Panzer used it for its line of advance. In his dispatch published the following year, Alexander summarized the story again, and he referred to General von Thoma, who was captured during Second Alamein, as confirming that the ruse was effective. And in 1950, Churchill made the story known throughout the world when it appeared in his war memoirs. And he again referenced von Thoma, the testimony of von Thoma after capture, as confirming the story. In 1953, Rommel's papers were published, and not all the papers had survived, but while the surviving papers did not mention a captured map, they were very revealing about Alam Halfa. Rommel believed that success would depend on adequate supplies, effective concealment of assembly, and speed of breakthrough and thrust. His plan was to break through quickly in the south, thrust rapidly eastwards, bypass Alam Halfa, and only turn north behind the Alamein position and turn north to Hammam. It did not work out like that. The defences in the south were stronger and took longer to penetrate than hoped. Having finally broken through, Rommel and Bayerlein decided that the attack would continue, but the Afrika Korps would turn immediately north to Alam Halfa. After the Afrika Korps turned north, it encountered bad going, used up fuel, and the attack had to be abandoned because it had gone from bad to worse. In Rommel's words, the vehicles and tanks of the Afrika Korps were painfully grinding their way through the soft sand covering their line of march. Driving sandstorms blew on and off all day, making the lives of my men a misery. Due to the heavy going, the Afrika Korps' petrol stocks were soon badly depleted, and at 1600 hours we called off the attack on Hill 132. Rommel ascribed the attack to the failure, to the strong enemy's failure, to the strong enemy defences in the south, heavy air attacks, and the shortage of petrol. He was extremely unamused when British prisoners taken during the battle said that they had fully expected and were prepared for Rommel's attack. He, of course, blamed the Italians. Von Mellitin, one of Rommel's senior staff officers, in his memoirs in 1955, quote, "I can confirm that this map was accepted as authentic and served its purpose in leading the Afrika Korps astray." And in a study of Alam Halfa, which was produced in 1956 for the US Marine Corps, Littlehart, Roberts, and Bayerlein wrote about the battle. Littlehart did not mention the ruse, but his fellow authors did. Pip Roberts, commander of 22nd Armoured Brigade during the battle, told the story of the map. It was perfectly feasible to find a suitable route by which to approach Alam Halfa from the south and west. It was also possible, if misled, to get into some very sticky going. During their advance, the enemy certainly went through this area of bad going and thereby indubitably increased his fuel consumption. In the same study, Bayerlein, who had not seen the Roberts contribution and vice versa, wrote, "Montgomery, as soon as he arrived in the Western Desert, as we later learned, heavily fortified the most important ridge, Alam Halfa, and prepared it for defence by placing the greater part of his armour there. He even allowed a map to fall into our hands on which the terrain south of Alam Halfa was shown as trafficable for armoured vehicles. Actually, it was bottomless sand which would create extreme difficulties for our wheeled vehicles. Thus far, we have universal agreement among British accounts as to the probable influence of the captured fake map, and we also have the testimony of 3 senior officers of the Africa Corps that the ruse worked. However, in 1959, Little Hart expressed doubt. He pointed out, quite rightly, that von Thoma did not arrive in Africa till after Alam Halfa, so his knowledge was second-hand. True, but it ignores von Mellenthin and Bayerlein. Little Hart also pointed out that Rommel had planned to drive east far to the south of the ridge and only changed his direction north to the ridge when he took so long to overcome the defences in the south. Again, this is true. However, Little Hart then went on to suggest that the ruse may have led Rommel to imagine, when he changed course, that the Alam Halfa ridge was more easily accessible than it proved. The soft sand area cramped the scope for local manoeuvre there. In 1960, the relevant volume of the Official History of the War in the Mediterranean Middle East by Playfair was published. He wrote that the map certainly found its way to Rommel's HQ, but there was no direct evidence it had influenced Rommel's change of plan. However, he added, the fact remains that the enemy experienced great difficulty with the going and used up a lot of fuel in consequence. That same year, Corelli, Bill Barnett's book on Britain's desert generals was published. Barnett wrote that Rommel turned north, not because of the fake map, but because of delays crossing the minefields and shortage of petrol, which is true. He ignores Little Hart's suggestion that the choice of route north, which proved so difficult an event, was influenced by the fake map. Bill Barnett's book was very controversial, and it prompted many veterans to take up the pen and write about the events of 1942 in the Western Desert. A lot of veterans objected to Bill Barnett's anti-Monty stance. And so there were quite a lot of letters and books and articles from Alexander down that appeared in response. One article was published in the SAHR, and it was by Fryer, who was involved with survey at GHQ in the Middle East in 1942. And in his article, he talks about the fake map. He offers his personal knowledge, and he quotes interesting testimony about the fake map. So Fryer says that de Guingamp had the cunning idea of making a going map which would link up with the maps already in German hands, and then to falsify a particular area to suit 8th Army plans. And he selected the area due south of the highest point. The tracings for the false map were prepared in the intelligence branch of the staff. The printing was carried out by 512 Field Survey Company, Royal Engineers, at the Tura Caves outside of Cairo. It was a very hush-hush one, an officer only. At the time, the company had an attached intelligence officer, Captain Gentile from New Zealand, and it was he who brought the finished traces of the fake map to the Tura Caves. Plates were made and the colours were printed on a base map by Captain Jock Murdoch, a Glaswegian and a printer by trade. He remembers the job because he had trouble with the machine, but he eventually finished in the early hours of the morning. Fryer was with him at the time and remembers putting the serial numbers on the maps as is always done with secret copies. The finished map looked just like any other going map, but part of it was phony. Having selected 5 or 6 copies at random, Fryer then took them to Cairo and gave them to the General Staff. and a copy of the map was planted on the enemy by means of a stage blowing up of a scout car in a minefield in the southern area. And the German side of the story is told by Paul Carrel, real name Paul Carl Schmidt, in his book on the Africa Corps, which Fryer quotes. Carrel says the map was found by a patrol and closely examined at Rommel's Forward HQ. After checking with their own maps, including previously captured ones, Rommel's staff was satisfied that it was both genuine, because it matched their proven information, and valuable, because it added new information. Carroll states that it was well printed by the first-class British map-making studios, a fine compliment to Murdoch's work. Carroll also states that it bore serial and code numbers and it seemed genuine enough. In fact, it was just what Rommel wanted, as he did not know the going in this part of the British front. The open sesame to the key point of the British position, the Alam Halfa height, was as good as in our hands. And in his book, Carrel concludes, the fake map had an important influence on the course of the Alam Halfa battle. What actually happened in the battle has been told many times, including by Horrocks in an article in 1957 and then in his memoirs published in 1960. Rommel's attack went very much as Monty said it would. Rommel's armoured forces were bogged down in the soft sand going, shown as good going on the map, and they were hammered by the Royal Artillery and the Desert Air Force, to both of whom tribute should be paid. It was known that Rommel's Achilles heel was his limited stocks of petrol, and his consumption was increased threefold in trying to get out of the sand. In days, the battle was over and Rommel withdrew beaten. After Horrocks' article appeared, Fryer corresponded with him. Horrocks replied, when General von Thoma was captured during Alamein 2 months later, he spent the first night at Montgomery's camp. Over dinner, he said that before Alam Halfa, they had captured a map which proved very helpful. I think this must be so. Horrocks concluded that the fake map bore wonderful fruit. Horrocks repeated the story of the ruse and von Thoma's statement in his memoirs, concluding that the fake map had a major influence on the battle. And there you see the famous meeting, Second Alamein, Montgomery and the captured General von Thoma. There were some rather critical questions in the House when this dinner was reported in the UK, and quite a bit of criticism and comment in the House and outside. In the House, Churchill diffused the comment by balefully looking round the House and saying, I too have dined with Montgomery. Horrocks is an important source. However, there seems to be a dispute between Horrocks, Freddie de Guingamp, Alexander and Churchill, which area or areas was or were falsified. I'll come on to that later. Suffice it to say that what is not in dispute is that in their advance, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions crossed the Ragil Depression with great difficulty, and that in its subsequent advance on point 132 on Alam Halfa Ridge, the 15th Panzer Division got well and truly bogged down in the Agram Depression. Building on the Ork's stopping of Rommel at First Alamein, at Alam Halfa, Monty inflicted a sharp defeat on Rommel and forced him onto the defensive. Rommel did not think the battle was insignificant, and Monty did not think the battle was insignificant. With characteristic exaggeration, Monty wrote, the victory at Alam Halfa had a profound effect on the 8th Army. The morale of the soldiers became outstanding. Rommel had been defeated in his purpose and had suffered severe casualties. The confidence of the troops in the higher command was re-established, and they entered into the preparations for the decisive battle that was to come with tremendous enthusiasm. I think that's rather overstating. Monty was not a modest man, although a great general, and unsurprisingly, in none of his accounts of the battle did he mention the fake map. So Fryer quotes convincing testimony as to its possession by and influence on the enemy, and he gives an eyewitness account of the production of the fake map. But the story doesn't end there, because the next year, a highly regarded and well-read history of Alamein was published by Michael Carver, who was with 7th Armoured Division at the time. He was doubtful that the various deception operations, including the fake map, had worked, which raises the obvious question that was it pure coincidence that Rommel's panzers attacked through an area falsely shown as fair going on a map, which his forces captured, and that his vehicles got bogged down? Coincidence? Regrettably, Carver provides neither references nor bibliography, although it's still a very good read from someone who was there. Books published since '62 have either not mentioned the ruse or have adopted Carver's conclusion that it's doubtful, not proven, that the fake map had influence. In 1966, an account of his intelligence work under Alexander was published by David Hunt. David Hunt, later ambassador and TV mastermind champion, a man with a brain the size of a planet, stated that the ruse clearly achieved its goal of luring Rommel's forces into the Agram Depression. In his book on deception in 1969, Barton Whaley criticised Little Heart and Playfair for not attaching any weight to the testimony on those of the receiving end, i.e. the Germans, and concluded that the ruse was effective. The relevant volume of the Official History of British Intelligence in the War by Harry Hinsley was published in 1981, and it details the breadth and depth of intelligence available to Rommel's opponents in the Western Desert in 1942, not least, of course, from signals interception and decryption, which was not made public until 1974. Surprisingly, Hinsley discusses the false-going map very briefly. He writes that the deception was designed to lead Rommel up to the ridge by the route that he eventually adopted. However, he adds Rommel's original plan was to cross bad going according to the fake map, which suggests that the deception was of no influence. Hinsley quotes from published accounts post-war, De Gingon, Carver, Hunt, Playfair, and from a post-war RAF narrative. Surprisingly, the official historian does not quote from any German account or from any wartime document, including the file specially concerned with the fake going map. I dare voice the suspicion that here we have the case of an historian or a researcher keen to get to the main event, Second Alamein, and using ready-to-hand secondary accounts after the war, rather than troubling himself with the German accounts or the original documents. Sir David Hunt was extremely unimpressed with Sir Harry Hinsley's coverage and conclusion. In his 1989 book on intelligence in war, Michael Handel discussed the ruse. He quoted British authorities for and against its influence. He explored the various possibilities, but without reaching a conclusion. He did accept that the map was captured by the Germans and that they regarded it as authentic. But like Hinsley, he did not quote any German authorities, although he did make an inaccurate reference to von Thoma, nor did he quote from the original file. And I now turn to the original file. That's the Tura Caves in Egypt. Though it's been open for many years, it's surprising that no book in only one article by Dovey in 1989 has utilized the file at Kew, which tells the story of the making of the map and contains early indications of its influence. The file shows that Bill Williams requested the fake map on 22nd of August on behalf of de Guingamp, and the request reached Stuart Menteith at 2200 on that day. The purpose was to deter the Afrika Korps from attacking along grid line 4387 and to divert them north to square 4388, i.e. Alam Halfa, where preparations had been made to receive them. So amendments were made to the eastern portion of the recently produced real map. Those amendments were devised by Stuart Menteith and Gentile, who drew them on a draft. The draft was then delivered to Burnett at 0110 on the 23rd. The sappers worked through the night, and by noon on the 24th, the proofs had been checked and copies had been delivered to de Guingamp. The operation was marked both by great speed and secrecy. Everything was destroyed or returned by hand of officer, and no record copy was kept. We know about this because Stuart Menteith relayed all this in a minute to the Director of Military Intelligence in January 1943. He also relayed the background. As both the Germans and Italians had captured sets of going maps and had reproduced them untouched for their own use, it was considered that they would take special notice of any new one. And the file contains two indications of the influence of the fake map, both of which Stuart Menteith also relayed to DMI. Just days after Rommel's defeat and retreat, Bill Williams wrote to Stuart Menteith to congratulate him on his admirable piece of work, adding that although we have no positive proof that it did the trick, enemy behaviour might argue that it played its part. And on January the 6th, 1943, De Freitas of MI14, GHQ Cairo, reported to Stuart Menteith the result of the recent debrief of a POW carried out at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre in Britain. Quote, a German thrust failed owing to shortage of fuel and confusion of orders, as a result of which the 21st Panzer Division withdrew. Some falsified maps were planted on the Germans, who were misled into sending their tanks into sandy terrain, which trebled their fuel consumption. Rommel blamed Kesselring for the failure of the thrust because he did not bring over the fuel by air as promised. The POW is not named, but only a very senior officer would have been sent to Egypt, from Egypt to CSDIC, and only a very senior officer would have been able to provide such insight into Rommel's defeat. The obvious inference is that it was von Thoma. 2 months after his capture, his dinner with an informal interrogation by Montgomery. And as an aside, it was von Thoma in his captivity in Britain that gave us the first concrete evidence of the German V-weapon program. So the file, which nobody looked at until 1989, and very few people have looked at since, shows that the fake map was produced in a remarkably short time. However, it's unlikely that it travelled from Cairo via the southern part of the Alamein front to the peripatetic Rommel much before the battle. We do not know for certain when it was captured or when it subsequently reached Rommel, either from British or German sources. Dovey tends towards the view that the map was captured on 29th of August and thus by implication reached Rommel either later that day or on the following day. And here I should stress that Rommel had planned to launch his attack on the 26th of August, but postponed it until 30th of August because of his fuel problems. Therefore, it is likely that the fake map arrived too late to influence Rommel's original plan, and it only became influential when the plan was changed during the battle and the Africa Corps redirected to Alam Halfa. A comparison between the real and the fake going maps in the file is very revealing. True map on the left, fake map on the right. It shows that the monochrome facsimiles published by de Guingamp were crude simplifications of the detailed coloured originals. It shows that the changes were actually very subtle. I know you're all struggling to see where the changes are. It also shows that, contrary to de Guingamp, several areas were falsified, not just one. The southeast corner of the false map, there is a very large blue area, impassable, which is not on the true map. Halfway up the eastern side of the false map, on the right, there's a small area of blue, again impassable and again not on the true map. And on the fake map, to the west of that small blue area, there is a small green area and then a large yellow area. The large yellow area is the Agram Depression immediately south of the Alam Halfa Ridge. And if you compare the Agram Depression yellow on the false map, you can see that in reality on the true map on the left, it was green, and in bold letters, Sandy is printed. So the Agram Depression has gone from beware to fair going. Comparing the two maps, one can say that Hinsley's right in that Rommel's original plan would have sent the Africa Corps through bad going as per the false map. The first stage of his original plan, which was only partly carried out, was for 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions to advance east and then northeast. But they would have traversed terrain that was correctly depicted on the false map. It was correctly shown as fair and then firm and fast. The second stage of the original plan, which was never carried out, would have involved crossing that small blue area on the eastern side of the map, halfway up. Therefore, one could say that the second stage of Rommel's original plan would justify Hindley's attitude to the fake map. But Hinsley, unspoken, has made two assumptions that are surely wrong. One, that the fake map had reached Rommel in time to influence his original planning. And remember, Rommel had originally planned to attack on the 26th of August. And secondly, that if it had indeed reached him in time, that he'd chosen to ignore it. He paid no attention to it at all, just dismissed it. And I think both of those assumptions are unlikely. The Ragil Depression is shown correctly on the fake map on the right. The Ragil Depression is south of the center. It is that broken blue line, ragged area enclosing a yellow area south of center. And that's exactly the same on both the true and the false map. The Ragil Depression was fair going. The problem with it was that it was surrounded by an escarpment, which was only broken in places. So crossing the Ragil, as the Africa Corps did, was slow and painful because of the limited opportunities offered by the escarpment to descend and then reascend. In a 2002 article on the battle, an American officer, Kevin Smith, showed that in the run-up to and during Alam Halfa, British intelligence and deception were very effective and far superior to German intelligence and deception, which up to that point had held their own, and thereby contributing significantly to Rommel's defeat. Examining Rommel's turn north to Alam Halfa and the role of the captured map, Smith concluded either Rommel knew nothing of the terrain south of Alam Halfa and assumed it would be suitable, or trusted the captured map and believed the terrain would be suitable. The implication of Smith's conclusion is clear. Rommel using a captured map to direct his forces is more plausible than Rommel ignoring a captured map, sending his forces into unknown terrain and hoping for the best. Smith demonstrates that British intelligence and deception were closely linked. Rommel's shortage of fuel was the result of the sinking of his supply ships through British interception and decryption of German signals. And this allowed British deception plans to work to the fullest and trap Rommel's armoured columns in soft sand where they could be destroyed. In other words, Rommel's attack through unsuitable terrain exacerbated his fuel situation, which through signals intelligence was both known to be his Achilles heel and had been successfully targeted. But as I've stated before, the role of signals intelligence was something which authors either did not know or could not mention to the mid-1970s. And Smith is not the first to use the word trap in relation to Alam Halfa. The distinguished military historian Ronald Lewin was a gunner at Alam Halfa. It was his first battle. And he wrote how impressed he was with the preparations, how impressed he was with the exercise that they carried out before the battle, and how much of a pasting they gave to Rommel. And Ronald Lewin uses the word trap. In his book on Alam Halfa and Alamein, Jonathan Dimbleby looks into the false map. He quotes Peter Vaux, who was intelligence officer with 7th Armoured, then 13 Corps. Vaux testifies to the falsifying of the map, the loss of the scout car and the German capture, German wheeled vehicles getting stuck in sand and being attacked from the air. Dimbleby concluded that a simple but effective ruse was responsible for getting Rommel's forces bogged down in the soft sand of the Agram Depression, and that this was of no small moment. There we have a photo of Monty in the centre. To his right is Horrocks, and to his left, wearing the black beret, is Pitt Roberts. So what was the situation on the other side of the hill, or should we say ridge? Rommel did not survive the war, nor did many of his papers, dying in ignorance of the ruse. Naring, who was commander of the Africa Corps, was severely wounded at the outset of the battle, and von Bismarck, no, not that Bismarck, another Bismarck, he was the commander of the 21st Panzer Division, and he was killed at the outset of the battle. Von Thoma, Bayerlein, von Mellenthin and Carrel are clear that a map was captured shortly before the battle and was of influence during it. Wearing his double hats, Bayerlein was surely best placed to know about the capture of the map and its influence. True, von Thoma was not there at the time, but when von Thoma arrived immediately after the battle to assume command of the Africa Corps, he was, as you may imagine, spent several days being fully briefed by Rommel and by his staff. And at this time, he was told about the recent battle, including the captured map. So there is a German consensus, except it was broken in 1980. Berendt was one of Rommel's intelligence officers, and in his book that was translated into English in 1989, 1985, he dismissed the captured map with some feeling. This is probably better in German, but it was no decisive factor at all. As a matter of fact, I do not think anyone has claimed that the map decided the battle, rather that it significantly influenced the course and outcome of the battle. I find it difficult to account for Berendt's statement. He was a very junior officer and merits only one mention in Rommel's published papers, a mention that has nothing to do with intelligence or Alam Halfa. Perhaps understandably, he was not present when the decision to change course and turn north to Alam Halfa arose out of the discussion between Rommel and Bayerlein. Perhaps understandably, he was embarrassed at the poor showing of Rommel's intelligence, i.e. his day job at Alam Halfa, as they missed both de Gingon's ruse, Monty's reinforcement and fortifying of Alam Halfa, bringing up formations and turning it into a fortress. In any case, his view is not shared by his superiors or by Carrel, who was shown a copy of the map by Bayerlein and discussed it with him. Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask, why would Rommel be influenced by a captured map, a captured British going map? Well, I, off the top of my head, can't think of any reason why a German Field Marshal would be interested in a captured British going map. Except I can. Thanks to the work of General Alfred Topper, who in 1952 edited a 2-volume study, German Experiences in Desert Warfare during the Second World War for the US Army, a study that was only declassified in 1990 to enable it to be used for the Gulf War. And more recent work by Malm in Germany and Hausler in Austria, we know a lot about the German side of things. Topper is an important, yet little known and rarely used source. I'm not aware of any British military historian using him. Among the 9 desert veterans involved in Topper's study, 5 held key posts in 1942. Kainau, military geologist; Müller, Panzer Commander; Westphal, operations officer at Panzer Army Africa; Kesselring, the commander in the theatre of the Mediterranean; and Bayerlein. Topper writes of British maps being incomparably better, so far as quality, accuracy, and detail were concerned, than the Italian maps. The British maps were considered a particularly valuable prize when captured. Of Alam Halfa, Topper writes, difficulties arose for attackers if they were compelled to use the southern portion of the desert proper, which in places was covered in soft soil. In its attack of 30th of August 1942 from the Alamein position, the Africa Corps had to contend with these difficulties. Above all, many motor vehicles became stuck in the passes that led from the ridges of hills to the depressions, and thus offered welcome targets for the enemy air forces. The failure of this attack can be attributed in part to the unfavourable ground, together with the overwhelming air superiority of the enemy, the weakness of our own forces, and the lack of motor fuel. He stresses that the German army preferred easily passable open desert for a battle site. And he emphasizes that the coloured hatches on maps indicating the passability of terrain, or at least the limitations on its passability, were important. Thus, General Topper's 2-volume study in 1952. He clearly demonstrates the importance of ground to the German forces in North Africa, their need for good maps, their distrust of Italian maps, and their faith in and use of captured British maps. The work of Hausler and Malm in more recent years clearly demonstrates the importance of ground and the need for good maps, as well as the enormous challenges facing German military geologists, surveyors and cartographers in North Africa. Both Malm and in several articles, Hausler quote Kuckelkorn, who was Rommel's chief military geologist in North Africa. In a 2018 piece, Hausler looks briefly into the question of the falsified British going map. He shows that the German trafficability maps were in very short supply, being handmade and not printed, unlike British and Italian ones. He shows that the German trafficability maps made of the Alamein position and used in planning Rommel's attack on Alam Halfa were inadequate, especially south of the ridge. He shows that the Afrika Korps regularly captured and habitually made use of British going maps. And he shows that the Afrika Korps, especially 15th Panzer, encountered deep sand attacking Alam Halfa, used up its fuel, and the attack had to be called off. The German evidence presented by Hausler is very persuasive. However, he wavers at the conclusion. He's swayed by non-German secondary sources like Barnett, wrongly in my judgment, and so he's not sure whether the captured map influenced the course and outcome of the battle. If influential, he believes it was not decisive, given the existence of other factors, such as German supply problems and the British penetration of German ciphers. Indeed, the Germans had supply problems, and indeed, the British had penetrated German ciphers, and the two things were linked. But as stated above, I'm not aware of anyone claiming that the captured map was decisive. Rather, that it significantly influenced the battle. In my years of study, I've come to the conclusion that battles are complex events and are decided by a combination of factors, never one. Kuckelkorn, in letters and speeches over a 20-year period from 42 to 62, he spoke of the great difficulties the Afrika Korps faced with classification in trafficability maps, in their creation and in their interpretation. And he looked back at the importance of and the shortcuts taken in producing trafficability maps for the Afrika Korps. So from the German language sources, Topper, Malm, Hausler and Kuckelkorn, to me, certain conclusions are inescapable. And you'll be relieved that we are reaching a conclusion. Rommel used captured British going maps because they gave him the information about terrain that he needed to mount his mobile operations effectively. He had a unit to analyse terrain and produce trafficability maps, but the unit was far too small and the theatre of operations far too large, so he had to rely on captured maps produced by his opponent. Unlike Libya, Egypt was enemy territory and he could not rely on the authorities to supply him willingly with maps. He distrusted Italian maps of Libya, let alone of Egypt. Given Rommel's reliance on trafficability maps for his modus operandi and the great difficulties the Afrika Korps faced in producing reliable trafficability maps of vast territories, especially enemy ones, it is surprising that captured British going maps, it's unsurprising that captured British going maps were seized upon. So my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, in relation to the falsified British going map and the Afrika Korps at Alam Halfa is as follows. In the surviving sources, whether in English or in German, I have seen no suggestion either that the map was not captured or that the Germans did not regard it as genuine. The only point at issue is its influence on the battle. Having assessed the available evidence, I conclude that on the balance of probabilities, it favours causation and not coincidence. Rommel did habitually rely on captured British maps, and he did attack through the Agram, an area of bad going falsely shown as fair on a map that he was allowed to capture. There is no dispute that Rommel was given a very bloody nose at Alam Halfa. His vehicles got bogged down in unsuitable terrain, using up more fuel than he could afford, were bombed by the Desert Air Force and shelled by the Royal Artillery. So, paying due respect to the flyers and the gunners, I believe that the sappers and their falsified map played a major part in bringing that about, and thereby contributed significantly to stopping what was Rommel's final offensive in the Western Desert. And so my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, is that the desert fox was outwitted by the desert rat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was masterful as always. I'm a great fan of going maps, as anybody who's been involved in planning or movement of vehicles will appreciate. And you opened my eyes, I think, to the fact that the Germans did not invest as much in their efforts to produce going maps as perhaps they should have done. Because I think we'll agree that there were times when they were in possession of territory for long enough to do some good work if they were so minded, or if they had the resources to do it. Okay, we have a couple of questions already, and I'm hoping that we'll get a few more. Helen has asked this question. When Rommel's senior officer von Thoma was captured, how quickly did he meet Montgomery, and where was he imprisoned as a POW?
Right, so von Thoma was the commander of the Africa Corps at Second Alamein. So this is October, November 1942. He was immediately taken to Montgomery's camp for dinner, the controversial dinner. And there are the famous photographs of the short Montgomery and the very tall von Thoma. And as I said, it led to questions in the House, which I think Churchill very effectively diffused. He was a POW in Egypt, and then he was transferred to the UK. He did go through the Central Interrogation Centre, and then he was sent to Farm Hall, which was a detention centre for senior officers. And as some of you may well know, the building was completely bugged, and the German senior officers spoke quite freely without realizing that. And that's how we discovered concrete evidence of the German V program. It was actually from von Thoma and one of these bugged conversations. But there is a literature on interrogation during the Second World War, and on Farm Hall, and on the bugging of the senior German officers.
Yeah, Helen Fry has written exclusively on that.
Indeed.
Andrew has asked, to what extent did Bletchley Park decoding assist in perhaps checking that the map ruse had been swallowed by Rommel? Enigma was not rich on tactical info, but interesting to ask nevertheless.
Well, it's a good question. There is extensive information about Ultra and Enigma, obviously in Hinsley's official history. Hinsley was at Bletchley Park, and he does rather over-egg Enigma and Ultra. There were other sources of intelligence as well. And to form a complete intelligence picture, you need several strands, including aerial photography, which often gets neglected, prisoner of war interrogation, which often gets neglected, and Y service, that's interception of low-level tactical communications which are not coded. The problem with reading the German signals is that Rommel didn't always tell Rome or Berlin the truth, either about his plans or about the state of his forces. And we were surprised several times in North Africa by the fact that Rommel's reconnaissance force turned out to be a major attack, because he had been economical with the actuality with regard both his plans and his forces. There is no evidence in anything that Bletchley Park decoded that relates to the actual German tactics at Alam Halfa, and you wouldn't expect that tactical intelligence to have been broadcast, intercepted and decoded by Bletchley Park. So the short answer to your question is that there is no ultra evidence of the ruse, and you would not expect there to be.
Okay, Andrew, again, thanks for a very interesting study. I just wondered, have you seen evidence of Britain using fake maps in other deception operations, either in North Africa or elsewhere?
Well, yes. The Battle of Megiddo in September 1918, Meinerzhagen is if this sounds familiar, there's a very good reason why it sounds familiar. He was shot at by a Turkish patrol. He managed to escape with his life and realized that he'd left his saddlebags behind in the melee. And of course, in the saddlebags were several maps showing the British plan for the Battle of Megiddo, and that the British were going to attack on the eastern open desert flank and not up the coast on the western flank. And as we all know, the thing was completely staged, the maps were faked, and Allenby actually attacked up the western coastal flank. And that is familiar because what de Guingamp did surely was a copy of what Meinerzhagen had done in 1918. And there are other examples as well. A fake map was produced in 2003 to do with the invasion of Iraq, but I'm not going to say any more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you talk about German reactions to the revelation of the ruse, because no one likes to be deceived, do they? Really, no one likes to be taken for a fool, and too often we should be suspect of when the golden egg falls into our hands, but human nature is such that we can't resist the temptation.
Well, it goes back a long way. During the American Revolutionary War, or War of Independence, or the unpleasantness, or whatever you wish to call it, several of Washington's messengers lost their saddlebags in escaping from or trying to avoid British patrols. And of course, what was captured was fake. It was deceptive. So that goes back to the 1770s.
It therefore falls to me, John, to thank you for really, really interesting talk this evening. We really enjoyed it. It was a fantastic presentation. You were going to do it last year, and for reasons we all know, we're not able to do so. So it was well worth the wait.
Oh, thank you.
Good night, everybody. Good night, John, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dudley.